How far would you go if someone in a lab coat told you to? Would you hurt someone? Would you go against your own conscience just because an authority figure ordered you to? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They are the very questions that a controversial and eye-opening series of experiments sought to answer back in the 1960s. Today we're diving deep into one of the most famous and infamous studies in the history of psychology, the Milgram obedience experiments. Imagine this. You've answered an ad in the newspaper. It's for a study on memory and learning at the prestigious Yale University. You walk into a laboratory and are greeted by a stern-looking man in a gray lab coat. He's the experimenter. You meet another participant, a friendly, middle-aged man. The experimenter explains the setup. One of you will be the teacher, and the other will be the learner. You draw slips of paper to decide your roles. You get teacher. The learner is taken into an adjacent room and strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his wrists. You, the teacher, are seated in front of an impressive-looking shock generator. It has a row of 30 switches, each labeled with a voltage, starting from 15 volts and going all the way up to 450 volts. Labels under the switches range from slight shock to danger, severe shock, with the final 2 switches simply marked XXX. Your job is simple. Read a list of word pairs to the learner. Then, you'll test his memory. For every wrong answer the learner gives, you are to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage by 1 level for each subsequent mistake. You're given a sample shock of 45 volts. It's a mild tingle, but it feels real. The experiment begins. The learner gets the first few answers right, then makes a mistake. You press the 15-volt switch. You hear a small grunt from the other room. He makes another mistake. 30 volts. Another. 45 volts. You keep going. At 75 volts, you hear a louder groan. At 120 volts, the learner shouts that the shocks are becoming painful. At 150 volts, he yells, "Experimenter, get me out of here. I won't be in the experiment anymore. I refuse to go on." What do? You look at the experimenter, the authority figure in the lab coat. He calmly tells you, "Please continue." If you hesitate again, he says, "The experiment requires that you continue." Then, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." And finally, "You have no other choice. You must go on." This was the scenario faced by hundreds of ordinary people in Stanley Milgram's experiments. The twist? The learner was an actor. The shocks weren't real. The grunts, the shouts, the pleas for help, and eventually the eerie silence from the other room. It was all a pre-recorded performance. The only real subject of the experiment was you, the teacher. The true purpose of the study wasn't about memory and learning at all. It was about obedience to authority. Milgram, a psychologist at Yale, was deeply troubled by the events of the Holocaust. He wanted to understand how seemingly normal people could participate in horrific acts. Was it something unique to a specific culture, or was it a darker, more universal aspect of human nature? Could it be that any of us, under the right circumstances, are capable of abandoning our moral compass simply because we are told to do so by someone in a position of authority? Before he began, Milgram polled his colleagues and Yale psychology students. He asked them to predict the outcome. How many people would go all the way to 450 volts? The consensus was that only a tiny fraction, perhaps 1 or 2%, the so-called psychopathic fringe, would administer the maximum shock. Most people, they believed, would stop as soon as the learner expressed pain. The reality was shocking. In the first and most famous variation of the experiment, a staggering 65% of participants, that is nearly 2 out of every 3 people, obeyed the experimenter's commands and continued to administer shocks all the way to the 450-volt maximum. They did this despite hearing the learner's screams, his complaints of a heart condition, and his eventual terrifying silence, which they were instructed to treat as a wrong answer. These weren't cruel or sadistic people. The participants were men from all walks of life: postal clerks, engineers, high school teachers, laborers, and they were in deep distress. They showed extreme signs of tension, sweating, trembling, stuttering, groaning, and even breaking into fits of nervous laughter. Many argued with the experimenter, pleading to stop. "I don't think I can go on with this," one participant said. "I don't think this is very humane." Yet, when the calm, authoritative voice of the experimenter insisted they continue, the majority complied. So, why did they do it? Milgram proposed several factors. First, the experiment took place at a prestigious institution, Yale University, which lent an air of credibility and legitimacy to the whole affair. The participants trusted that the experts knew what they were doing and that everything was safe. Second, the experimenter's presence was a powerful force. He was a symbol of authority, calm and resolute in his lab coat. His simple, prodding statements framed obedience as a requirement of the situation, shifting the responsibility away from the participant. When participants asked who would be responsible if the learner was harmed, the experimenter would reply, "I am responsible." This diffusion of responsibility was a key psychological mechanism. The participants could reframe their actions as simply following orders, with the authority figure bearing the moral weight. Another crucial factor was the gradual escalation. The experiment didn't start with a 450-volt shock. It started with a tiny 15-volt jolt. Each step was just a small increment from the last. This created a slippery slope. Once a person had delivered a 150-volt shock, what was the moral difference in delivering a 165-volt one? This step-by-step commitment made it harder to find a clear line to draw and say, no. Milgram also ran numerous variations of the experiment to test these factors. When the experiment was moved from Yale to a rundown office building in a nearby city, obedience dropped to 48%, still alarmingly high, but showing that the prestige of the setting did matter. When the experimenter gave orders over the phone instead of being in the room, obedience plummeted to just 21%. The physical presence of authority was clearly critical. In another fascinating variation, when the participant had to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped to 30%. The more direct and personal the act of inflicting pain became, the harder it was for people to obey. Perhaps most hopefully, when participants were in a room with two other teachers, who were actually actors, who refused to continue, 90% of the real participants also chose to defy the experimenter. The power of peer rebellion was even stronger than the power of authority. This shows us the incredible importance of solidarity and having the courage to be the first to speak up against something that is wrong. The Milgram experiments were, and remain, hugely controversial. Ethically, they are a minefield. Participants were deceived and subjected to immense psychological stress. They were forced to confront a disturbing truth about themselves, that they were capable of causing extreme harm to an innocent person. Many left the experiment shaken and ashamed. Milgram argued that the follow-up debriefing, where the learner was revealed to be unharmed and the true nature of the experiment was explained, helped to alleviate this stress. He reported that in a follow-up questionnaire, 84% of participants said they were glad to have been in the experiment. Nevertheless, these studies prompted a major overhaul of ethical guidelines for psychological research. Today, an experiment like Milgram's would never be approved by an institutional review board. The well-being of the participants must always be the highest priority. But the lessons of the Milgram experiments are more relevant today than ever. They serve as a powerful and chilling reminder of the dangers of blind obedience. They show how ordinary people can become agents in terrible processes, not because they are evil, but because their moral sense becomes subordinate to a powerful authority. It forces us to ask ourselves tough questions. In our own lives, at work, in our communities, when do we follow orders, and when do we follow our conscience? The Milgram experiment isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror held up to human nature. It reveals a vulnerability that we all share. But it also reveals our capacity for defiance. It reminds us that while the pressure to conform can be immense, the power to resist, especially when we stand together, is even greater. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think you would have done in that situation? It's a tough question, I know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration into the human psyche as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the big ideas that shape our world. We'll see you in the next video.